The sun hung low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty plains of Willow Creek. Frank Dawson leaned against the fence post at the edge of his property, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He had spent most of the day fixing a broken gate out by the south pasture, and now all he wanted was to head home and enjoy a cold beer on the porch with Linda, his wife. But something caught his eye as he turned toward the main entrance of the ranch. A cluster of unfamiliar vehicles parked right in front of the gravel driveway. At first glance, it looked like 2 or 3 pickup trucks, their beds loaded with tools and equipment. Men in work boots and faded baseball caps stood around, talking amongst themselves. Some were inspecting maps spread out on the hood of one of the trucks, while others seemed to be setting up what appeared to be surveying gear. Frank squinted, trying to make sense of the scene. None of these people belonged here. They weren't neighbors, and they certainly hadn't asked permission to be on his land. He sighed heavily, feeling irritation rise in his chest. Strangers showing up uninvited wasn't uncommon in this part of the country. Salesmen, hunters, even lost tourists, occasionally wandered onto private property. But there was something about this group that felt different. Something off. For one thing, they didn't look like casual passers-by. Their demeanor suggested purpose, and whatever their purpose was, it clearly involved his ranch. Frank straightened, up brushing dirt off his hands. He started walking down the lane toward the entrance, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. As he approached, one of the men noticed him and nudged the others. By the time Frank reached the gate, the entire group had turned to face him. One man stepped forward, extending a hand. "Morning," the stranger said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Name's Carl Harper. We're with Geotech Exploration." Frank didn't take the offered hand. Instead, he crossed his arms over his chest and gave Carl a hard stare. "Don't care who you are," he replied flatly. "You're blocking my entrance. What do you want?" Carl dropped his hand, unfazed by Frank's brusque tone. "We're conducting geological surveys in the area," he explained. "Your property falls within our designated zone. We need access to run some tests." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Tests for what?" "That's not really your concern," Carl said smoothly. "But I can assure you it's nothing that'll affect your operations here. Just routine data collection." Frank snorted. Routine data collection? That didn't sit right with him. He'd lived on this land for nearly 30 years, raising cattle and growing crops. If anyone needed to know what was happening on his property, it was him, and he sure as hell wasn't going to let a bunch of strangers waltz in without so much as a "by your leave." "You've got no right to be here," Frank said firmly. "This is private property. You want to test something, find another spot." Carl's smile tightened and the friendly veneer slipped just a little. "Look, Mr. Dawson," Frank supplied curtly. "Mr. Dawson," Carl continued, "we're working with permits issued by the state. This isn't personal, it's business. Now if you'll step aside, we'll get started." "No," Frank said simply. The word hung in the air between them, heavy and final. "I already told you, you're not coming through here." For a moment, nobody moved. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Carl glanced at his companions, exchanging subtle nods. Without another word, they began unpacking their gear, completely ignoring Frank's protests. It was as if he weren't even standing there. Frank clenched his fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface. He knew better than to start a physical altercation. He wasn't a young man anymore, and these guys looked like they could hold their own in a fight. Still, the audacity of their actions infuriated him. Who did they think they were? Barging onto his land like they owned the place? Before he could say anything else, a voice called out from behind him. "Frank? What's going on?" It was Linda. She had come out of the house, drawn by the commotion. Her auburn hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and she wore an apron dusted with flour, evidence of the bread she'd been baking earlier. Her green eyes darted between Frank and the strangers, searching for answers. "These folks think they can just park themselves at our gate and do whatever they please," Frank muttered darkly. Linda frowned, stepping closer to her husband. "Is that true?" she asked, addressing Carl directly. There was steel in her voice, though her tone remained polite. "We're following orders," Carl replied, avoiding eye contact. Like I told your husband, this is official business. Official business doesn't mean squat if you don't have permission, Linda shot back. She placed a hand on Frank's arm, both to steady herself and to offer silent support. You should leave before things get ugly. Carl smirked, clearly unimpressed by the warning. Listen, ma'am, we're not leaving until we finish our job. So unless you plan to call the cops, and trust me, they won't side with you, I suggest you back off. Frank felt Linda stiffen beside him. He knew she hated being dismissed, especially by someone who thought they could intimidate her. But instead of snapping back, she took a deep breath and turned to Frank. What are you going to do about this? She asked quietly. Frank hesitated. He couldn't physically remove them, and calling the sheriff wouldn't accomplish much, not when Carl claimed to have state-issued permits. No, he needed a different approach, something unexpected, something that would make them regret ever setting foot on his land. An idea began to form in his mind. Slowly, a grin spread across his face. I've got an idea, he said to Linda. Wait here. He strode back toward the barn, leaving Linda to keep an eye on the intruders. Inside, he rummaged through a pile of old tools and scrap wood until he found what he was looking for: a battered wooden board and a can of paint. Grabbing both, he carried them outside and set to work. By the time he returned to the entrance, the makeshift sign was complete. Painted in bold black letters against the weathered wood were the words, $100 toll to enter my property. Linda blinked in surprise. What are you doing? Giving them exactly what they deserve, Frank replied with a satisfied nod. He planted the sign firmly in the ground next to the gate, making sure it was visible to anyone approaching. Then he turned to face Carl and his crew, crossing his arms once more. If you want to come through here, Frank announced loudly, you'll have to pay the toll, $100 per vehicle. Carl stared at him, dumbfounded. You're joking, right? Nope, Frank said cheerfully. That's the price. Pay up or turn around. The other men exchanged uncertain glances, unsure how to respond. This wasn't part of the plan. Carl scowled, clearly annoyed by Frank's antics. Fine, he snapped. Have it your way. But this little stunt won't stop us forever. Oh, I think it will, Frank countered. His tone was light, almost playful, but there was no mistaking the resolve in his eyes. Let's see how far your official business gets you when every inch of progress costs you a Benjamin. With that, Frank walked back to the house, Linda trailing behind him. As they settled onto the porch, watching the standoff unfold from a safe distance, Linda shook her head and chuckled. You really are something else, you know that? Frank grinned, leaning back in his chair. Sometimes you've got to fight, fire with fire. And so, the blockade began. Not with threats or violence, but with a simple act of defiance that would soon ripple far beyond the boundaries of Frank Dawson's ranch. The next morning, Frank Dawson woke up earlier than usual. The events of the previous day were still fresh in his mind. The strangers blocking his entrance, their refusal to leave, and his decision to charge them a toll. It had been a bold move, one born out of frustration and a desire to protect what was his. But now, as he sat at the kitchen table sipping coffee, he couldn't help but wonder if it would actually work. Linda bustled around the room, packing lunches and preparing breakfast. She glanced at him occasionally, her brow furrowed with concern. You really think they'll pay? She asked finally, breaking the silence. Frank shrugged, leaning back in his chair. I don't know, he admitted. But it doesn't matter. If they want to play games, I'm ready. Linda sighed, setting down a plate of scrambled eggs in front of him. Just be careful, okay? These people aren't messing around. I will, Frank promised, though his tone suggested he wasn't too worried. Deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. Whatever these strangers wanted, they weren't going to give up easily. And neither was he. By mid-morning, the ranch entrance was bustling with activity again. Carl Harper and his crew had returned, looking even more irritated than before. They'd clearly expected Frank to back down overnight, but instead, they found him standing by the toll sign, arms crossed and jaw set. Carl climbed out of his truck, slamming the door behind him. This is ridiculous, he growled, striding, up to Frank. You can't just charge us money to come onto your property. Sure I can, Frank replied calmly. It's my land, my rules. You want to drive through here? You pay the toll. Carl glared at him, his face reddening with anger. You're holding us up, old man. This isn't some joke, we've got work to do. Then pay up or find another way in, Frank said, his voice steady. Your choice. For a moment, Carl looked like he might explode. Instead, he turned to his crew, muttering something under his breath. After a brief discussion, one of the men reluctantly pulled out a wallet and handed over $100 bill. Carl snatched it from him and thrust it into Frank's hand. There, Carl snapped. Happy now? Frank didn't respond. He tucked the money into his pocket and stepped aside, allowing the truck to pass. As it rumbled down the driveway, he felt a small sense of satisfaction. Maybe this plan of his could actually work. Word of Frank's toll booth spread quickly through Willow Creek. By lunchtime, Grace Miller, a retired schoolteacher who lived down the road, showed up with a tray of lemonade and cookies. She parked her car near the gate and walked over to where Frank was keeping watch. I heard about what happened, she said, handing him a glass of lemonade. Thought you might need a little refreshment. Frank accepted it gratefully. Thanks, Grace. That's mighty kind of you. Grace smiled warmly. Don't mention it. Honestly, I think what you're doing is brilliant. Someone needs to stand up to those guys. Frank chuckled, shaking his head. I'm no hero, just trying to protect my land. Well, you're doing a fine job of it, Grace replied. She glanced at the toll sign, then back at Frank. How many have paid so far? Just the one, Frank admitted. But I reckon more'll show up soon enough. Grace nodded thoughtfully. If you need any help, let me know. I may not be much use out here, but I can rally the neighbors if things get worse. Frank appreciated the offer, though he hoped it wouldn't come to that. For now, he was content to handle things on his own. Still, it meant a lot to have someone like Grace in his corner. As the afternoon wore on, more vehicles arrived at the ranch entrance. Each time, Frank repeated the same routine. Arms crossed, toll demanded, payment collected. Some drivers grumbled and complained, but most eventually forked over the cash. Others tried to argue, claiming they hadn't been told about the fee or insisting they had permission to enter. Frank listened patiently, never wavering in his stance. You want to talk permits? He said to one particularly vocal driver. Fine. But until we sort that out, it's $100 to get past me. The driver cursed under his breath but ultimately paid up. As the day went on, Frank kept meticulous records in a weathered notebook, jotting down names, license plate numbers, and amounts paid. He figured it might come in handy later. If nothing else, it proved that he was serious about enforcing the toll. By evening, the tension had eased somewhat. Most of Carl's crew seemed resigned to paying the fee, though they made sure to express their displeasure every chance they got. Frank ignored their complaints, focusing instead on the growing stack of cash in his pocket. It wasn't about the money, it was about sending a message. When Linda brought dinner out to the gate, she found Frank sitting on a folding chair, looking surprisingly relaxed. How's it going? She asked, setting the food down beside him. Better than I expected, Frank replied, digging into a sandwich. They're paying. Grudgingly, but they're paying. Linda smiled, though her eyes remained troubled. Still, I don't like the way they're acting. They're planning something, Frank, I can feel it. Frank nodded. Probably. But whatever it is, we'll deal with it when it comes. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows, across the ranch the flow of vehicles slowed to a trickle. Frank packed up his things and headed back to the house, feeling a mix of exhaustion and triumph. He hadn't solved the problem. Not yet. But he'd taken a stand. And sometimes, that was all it took to change the course of things. Later that night, as they sat together on the porch, Linda rested her head on Frank's shoulder. You know, she said softly, people are talking about you in town. They say you're crazy, brave, or both. Frank laughed quietly. Maybe they're right. But if being crazy means protecting what's ours, then so be it. Linda squeezed his hand. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. And with that, they sat in comfortable silence. watching the stars appear one by one in the vast prairie sky. The battle was far from over, but for now, they allowed themselves a moment of peace. The days that followed were anything but calm. Frank Dawson's toll booth had become a symbol of defiance not just for him, but for the entire town of Willow Creek. News of his stand against Carl Harper and his crew spread like wildfire, sparking conversations at the local diner, the feed store, and even the post office. Some folks thought Frank was foolish after all. How could one man take on a big corporation? Others admired his courage, seeing him as a hero who refused to back down. But as the attention grew, so did the pressure. Carl and his team weren't about to let Frank's antics derail their plans. They started arriving earlier each morning, often before sunrise, hoping to catch him off guard. When that didn't work, they tried sneaking through the property line at night, avoiding the toll booth altogether. It quickly became clear that Frank couldn't keep watch 24 hours a day. Linda noticed the strain on her husband's face. He was tired, running on little sleep and too much coffee. One evening, after another long day of confrontations, she sat him down at the kitchen table. "You can't do this alone anymore," she said firmly. "It's not safe." Frank sighed, rubbing his temples. "I know," he admitted. "But what choice do I have? If I back down now, they'll walk all over us." Linda reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "You're not alone, Frank. We're here. With you. Let Jake help. He's old enough." Frank hesitated. Jake, their 16-year-old son, had been eager to pitch in since the beginning, but Frank didn't want to drag him into something that could turn ugly. Still, Linda had a point. With Carl's crew growing bolder, they needed all the help they could get. That night, Frank called Jake into the living room. The boy looked up from his phone, surprised to see both his parents sitting there. "What's going on?" he asked. "We need your help," Frank said simply. "Things are getting worse out there, and we can't keep watch around the clock. Your mom thinks you should take shifts with me." Jake's eyes lit up with excitement, though he tried to play it cool. "Sure, Dad. What do you need me to do?" Frank explained the situation, emphasizing the importance of staying alert and keeping a low profile. "This isn't a game," he warned. "These guys mean business. If anything feels wrong, you call me or your mom immediately. Got it?" Jake nodded solemnly. "Got it." The next day, Frank and Jake worked together to fortify the ranch entrance. They stacked bales of hay along the sides of the driveway, creating a makeshift barrier that would slow down anyone trying to force their way through. They also installed floodlights donated by Grace Miller, who had rallied some of the neighbors to contribute supplies. By sunset, the entrance looked more like a checkpoint than a simple toll booth. That night, Jake took his first shift. Armed with a flashlight and a thermos of hot chocolate Linda had prepared, he settled into a folding chair beside the toll sign. Frank stayed awake inside the house, ready to intervene if needed. For hours, nothing happened. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of wind through the grass. Around midnight, however, Jake heard the faint rumble of an engine in the distance. He stood up, gripping the flashlight tightly as a pair of headlights appeared on the horizon. As the vehicle drew closer, he recognized it as one of Carl's trucks. His heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. When the truck stopped in front of the gate, the driver rolled down his window. "Hey, kid," he called out. "Where's your dad?" "He's busy," Jake replied, mimicking his father's firm tone. "If you want to come through, it's $100. The driver laughed, clearly amused by the teenager's bravado. "Listen, Junior, I don't have time for this nonsense. Move those bales or I'll move them myself." Jake shook his head. "No can do. Rules are rules." The driver scowled, muttering something under his breath. After a moment of hesitation, he reached for his wallet and tossed a bill onto the ground. "There. Happy now?" Jake picked up the money, careful to keep his distance. "Thanks," he said evenly. "Have a good night." As the truck drove off, Jake felt a surge of pride. He'd handled the situation just like his dad would have. When Frank came outside to check on him a few minutes later, Jake grinned. "Told you I could handle it." Frank clapped him on the shoulder. "Good job, son. Looks like you've got my back." Despite their preparations, tensions continued to rise. Carl's men began targeting not just Frank but anyone who showed support for him. One evening, Grace Miller discovered that someone had slashed the tires of her car. A note left on her windshield read, "Stay out of things that don't concern you." Grace reported the incident to Sheriff Joe Collins, who promised to look into it. But when she shared the news with Frank, he knew it was a warning meant for him as much as for her. "They're getting desperate," he told Linda later that night. "And desperate people do stupid things." Linda nodded, worry etched on her face. "We need to be smarter than them, Frank. Smarter and stronger." Sheriff Collins visited the ranch a few days later, bringing updates and bad news. "I talked to the company these guys are working for," he explained. "They claim they're conducting legitimate geological surveys and have permits to operate in the area. There's not much I can do unless they break the law." Frank clenched his fists. "So what? They just get to walk all over us because they have papers?" "I didn't say that," Sheriff Collins replied gently. "But right now, this is your fight. All I can do is keep an eye on things and make sure nobody crosses the line." Frank understood where the sheriff was coming from, but it didn't make the situation any easier. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he realized something important. This wasn't just about protecting his land anymore. It was about standing up for the entire community. If Carl and his crew succeeded in taking over his property, who would stop them from doing the same to others? The next morning, Frank made a decision. He called a meeting at the town hall, inviting everyone in Willow Creek to attend. Word spread quickly, and by the time the meeting started, the room was packed. People filled the rows of chairs, spilling into the aisles and leaning against the walls. Frank stood at the front, flanked by Linda and Jake. He cleared his throat, nervously, unused to speaking in front of such a large crowd. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "I know most of you have heard about what's been happening at my place. These guys, Carl Harper and his crew, they think they can push us around, act like we don't matter, but we matter. This town matters, and it's time we showed them that." The audience erupted into applause, cheering loudly. Encouraged by their support, Frank pressed on. "Now, I'm not asking anyone to put themselves in danger, but if we stick together, if we show them that we're united, maybe we can make them leave us alone for good." By the end of the meeting, the townspeople had formed a plan. They agreed to take turns watching the ranch entrance, ensuring that Frank and his family weren't overwhelmed. Grace volunteered to help organize fundraisers to cover legal fees, while others offered food, supplies, and whatever else they could spare. For the first time in weeks, Frank felt a glimmer of hope. The battle was far from over, but with the Yachty, entire town behind him, he knew they stood a fighting chance. Together, they would protect their home and their future. Grace Miller wasn't one to sit idle when trouble came knocking. Though she was retired, her years as a schoolteacher had taught her the value of curiosity and persistence. When Frank Dawson called the town meeting and asked for help, Grace knew exactly where she could make a difference. While others volunteered to stand guard or organize fundraisers, she decided to dig deeper into the company behind Carl Harper's operation. If they were hiding something, and Grace suspected they were, it might be the key to stopping them once and for all. The next morning, Grace set up shop at her dining room table, surrounded by stacks of printed documents, notebooks, and her trusty laptop. Her first step was simple enough: search online for information about geotech exploration, the name Carl had mentioned during their standoff. At first glance, the company seemed legitimate. Their website boasted sleek graphics and promises of innovative geological solutions. But Grace wasn't fooled by pretty pictures and buzzwords. She clicked through page after page, looking for cracks in their polished facade. It didn't take long to find inconsistencies. For starters, Geotech's contact information led to an anonymous P.O. box in a distant city, rather than a physical office. Then there were the reviews, scattered across forums and blogs, from former employees and local residents who claimed the company engaged in shady practices. One comment stood out. "They promised us jobs and economic growth, but all we got was pollution and broken promises." Grace leaned back in her chair, frowning. Something about this felt familiar. She rummaged through her filing cabinet until she found a newspaper clipping from years ago, detailing a similar controversy in another part of the state. A different company had come in under the guise of exploration, only to leave behind environmental devastation that took decades to repair. Could it be happening again? Determined to connect the dots, Grace spent hours poring over public records, corporate filings, and scientific reports. She even reached out to old colleagues who specialized in environmental law, hoping they could shed light on what geotech might really be after. By late afternoon, her eyes were tired, but her resolve hadn't wavered. And then, finally, she found it, a document buried deep within a government database. According to the report, geotech wasn't just conducting geological surveys. They were planning to drill for oil beneath Willow Creek. Worse still, the drilling process involved hydraulic fracturing, commonly known as fracking. Grace knew enough about fracking to understand its risks. Contaminated groundwater, increased seismic activity, and irreversible damage to ecosystems. If geotech succeeded, the entire town could suffer, not just Frank's ranch, but everyone's homes, farms, and livelihoods. Her hands trembled as she printed out the evidence. This changed everything. It wasn't just about blocking trespassers anymore. It was about protecting the very foundation of their community. Grace grabbed her coat and headed straight to the Dawsons' house, clutching the papers tightly in her hand. When she arrived, Frank and Linda were sitting on the porch sipping coffee and discussing strategies for the days ahead. Jake was tinkering with the floodlights near the entrance, humming softly to himself. Grace climbed the steps and held up the folder. "You need to see this," she said urgently. Frank raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" "It's about geotech," Grace explained, taking a seat beside them. She spread the documents across the table, pointing out key details. "They're not here for surveys. They want to drill for oil using fracking. And if they succeed, it'll destroy our water supply and ruin the land." Linda gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be," Grace replied. "I've double-checked everything. This isn't speculation, it's fact." Frank stared at the papers, his jaw tightening. He'd suspected Carl and his crew were up to no good, but this went beyond anything he'd imagined. "Why would they pick Willow Creek?" he muttered. "There's nothing special about this place." Grace sighed. "That's what they want us to think. But look at the map." She unfolded a large printout showing the region, marked with red circles highlighting potential drilling sites. Willow Creek sits right above a major shale formation. If they start drilling here, they won't stop until they've sucked every drop of oil out of the ground. For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air. Finally, Linda broke the silence. "What do we do now?" "We fight back," Frank said firmly. "But we can't do it alone. We need to tell the whole town." Grace nodded. "Agreed. People deserve to know the truth. Once they understand what's at stake, they'll join us." The next evening, the community gathered once again at the town hall. This time, the mood was somber. Frank stood at the front holding up Grace's findings for everyone to see. "This isn't just about my ranch anymore," he began. "It's about all of us. These people aren't surveyors. They're oil drillers. And if they get their way, they'll destroy everything we hold dear." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Frank passed around copies of the documents. Some folks looked shocked, others angry, but most seemed determined. After years of living off the land, they understood how fragile their environment was and how much they had to lose. One farmer named Bill stepped forward, his face flushed with emotion. "I've lived here my whole life," he said. "If they mess with our water, we're done for. My crops, my livestock, it's all gone." Another resident, a young mother named Anna, added, "And what about our kids? What kind of future will they have if we let this happen?" The room erupted into agreement. By the end of the meeting, a new plan was in motion. Grace suggested creating flyers and social media posts to raise awareness beyond Willow Creek, while Bill offered to contact environmental groups for support. Others volunteered to patrol the ranch entrance more frequently. ensuring Carl's crew couldn't sneak past unnoticed. As the meeting wrapped up, Frank pulled Grace aside. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "None of this would have been possible without you." Grace smiled, though her expression remained serious. "Don't thank me yet. We've got a long road ahead of us. But I believe in this town, and in you." That night, as Frank and Linda lay in bed, the enormity of the situation settled over them. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for their neighbors, their friends, and the generations to come. It was a daunting responsibility, but also a deeply humbling one. The battle lines had been drawn, and the UAE stakes were higher than ever. But with the truth on their side and the entire town united, Frank knew they had a fighting chance. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, as a family and as a community. The days following the town hall meeting were a blur of activity. Flyers plastered every bulletin board in Willow Creek, and social media posts about geotech's plans reached far beyond the small town. People from neighboring communities began reaching out, offering support, and asking how they could help. For the first time, Frank Dawson felt like they weren't alone in this fight. But he knew the real test was yet to come. Geotech wasn't going to back down quietly. When news of the community's resistance spread, the company responded with threats disguised as legal notices. Letters arrived at Frank's mailbox, warning him of lawsuits for obstruction and extortion. Carl Harper showed up one afternoon, his face red with anger, demanding that Frank remove the toll sign immediately. "You're playing a dangerous game," Carl spat. "This isn't over." Frank didn't flinch. "It won't be over until you leave my land and my town alone." But the warnings weren't empty. Lawyers descended on Willow Creek, knocking on doors and pressuring residents to abandon their cause. Some folks wavered, intimidated by the prospect of being dragged into court. Others stood firm, bolstered by the growing momentum of the movement. Grace Miller worked tirelessly to reassure everyone, reminding them that standing together made them stronger. Despite the pressure, preparations continued. Bill, the farmer, helped reinforce the barriers at the ranch entrance, adding more bales of hay and even a makeshift barricade made from old tractor parts. Anna organized a potluck dinner to raise funds for legal fees, while Jake created flyers and posted updates online, drawing attention from environmental activists across the state. Every night, the Dawsons' house buzzed with activity as neighbors dropped by to strategize or simply show their support. Then came the day everyone had been dreading. Early one foggy morning, the sound of engines roared through the stillness. Frank woke with a start, pulling on his boots and rushing outside. What he saw made his blood run cold. A convoy of bulldozers and trucks, flanked by private security guards, rolling steadily toward the ranch entrance. Linda joined him moments later, her eyes widening in alarm. "Frank, what do we do?" "We stand our ground," Frank replied, though his voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. He grabbed his phone and sent a quick text to the group chat they'd set up for emergencies. Within minutes, cars began arriving. From all directions, neighbors poured out of their vehicles, armed with signs, banners, and determination etched on their faces. By the time the convoy reached the gate, a sizable crowd had gathered. Grace held up a megaphone, her voice ringing out clearly. "You are not welcome here. Turn around and leave our land alone." The lead bulldozer slowed to a stop, its massive blade looming over the barricade. A man in a suit stepped forward, flanked by 2 security guards. "We have every right to be here," he announced. "Your actions are illegal and we will proceed as planned." "No, you won't," Frank said, stepping in front of the crowd. His voice was calm, but firm. "Not unless you plan to run me over first." The man in the suit smirked. "Don't tempt us, Mr. Dawson. This is bigger than you." "It's not just about me," Frank shot back. "It's about all of us." He gestured to the crowd behind him. "These people are my family, my neighbors, and we're not letting you destroy our home." For a moment, no one moved. The tension crackled in the air like electricity. Then Sheriff Joe Collins arrived, parking his cruiser near the gate. He climbed out, adjusting his hat as he surveyed the scene. "All right, folks," he said, raising his hands. Let's keep this peaceful. Nobody needs to get hurt. Carl Harper appeared beside the man in the suit, glaring at Frank. Sheriff, these people are obstructing legal operations. Arrest them if you have to. Joe shook his head. I don't see any laws being broken right now. All I see is a bunch of citizens exercising their rights. So unless someone starts something, I suggest you leave. The man in the suit clenched his jaw but nodded curtly. Fine, we'll retreat. For now. But this isn't over. As the convoy slowly backed away, cheers erupted from the crowd. People hugged each other, tears streaming down their faces. Frank let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. They'd won this round, but he knew it was only temporary. Geotech wouldn't give up easily. That evening, the community gathered at the local diner to celebrate their victory. Plates of fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and pie filled the tables, and laughter echoed through the room. Grace raised a glass, her eyes shining with pride. To Frank and to all of us. Together we showed them that we're stronger than they thought. Frank stood up, humbled by the applause. I didn't do this alone, he said. None of us could have done it without the rest of you. This fight isn't just mine. It belongs to everyone who calls Willow Creek home. As the celebration wound down, Linda pulled Frank aside. How long do you think we have before they try again? Frank sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. Not long, but we'll be ready. Whatever happens next, we'll face it together. Over. The next few weeks, life in Willow Creek returned to a semblance of normalcy, but beneath the surface, the tension remained. Legal battles raged on, with Geotech filing multiple lawsuits against Frank and several other residents. Grace spent countless hours coordinating with lawyers and environmental groups, ensuring they had the resources to fight back. Meanwhile, Bill and Jake worked on strengthening the defenses at the ranch entrance, knowing another confrontation was inevitable. Through it all, the community stayed united. Strangers became friends and friends became family. Even those who had initially doubted Frank's methods now stood firmly by his side, realizing that this fight was about more than just land. It was about preserving their way of life. Late. One night, as Frank sat on the porch with Linda, watching the stars twinkle above the fields, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. We might not win in the end, he admitted softly. But at least we tried. At least we didn't let them take everything without a fight. Linda smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. And that's what matters most. No matter what happens, we did the right thing. In the quiet darkness, surrounded by the sounds of crickets and distant coyotes, Frank allowed himself a moment of peace. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for now they had hope, and each other. That was enough to keep fighting for. Months passed, and the battle between Willow Creek and Geotech dragged on. Courtrooms replaced pastures as the primary battleground, with lawyers trading arguments while residents waited anxiously for justice to prevail. Frank Dawson spent countless days sitting in uncomfortable chairs, listening to legal jargon that often went over his head. But he never missed a hearing, determined to see the fight through to the end. Linda accompanied him every step of the way, bringing snacks and offering words of encouragement during breaks. You're doing great, she'd whisper whenever Frank looked overwhelmed. And though he sometimes doubted himself, her unwavering support kept him grounded. Grace Miller played a crucial role behind the scenes, coordinating fundraisers and rallying environmental groups to provide expert testimony. Her research became the backbone of the case, proving beyond doubt that Geotech's plans posed significant risks to the community. Bill and Anna organized petitions, gathering signatures from not just Willow Creek, but neighboring towns as well. Even Jake got involved, creating social media campaigns that drew national attention to their cause. The turning point came one crisp autumn morning when the judge delivered her verdict. After months of deliberation, she ruled in favor of Frank and the residents of Willow Creek. Geotech's permits were revoked, citing unethical practices and insufficient consideration of environmental impacts. Cheers erupted in the courtroom, tears streaming down faces as people embraced one another. Frank stood silently, letting the weight of the moment sink in. He hadn't expected to win, not completely. But here they were, victorious against one of the largest corporations in the region. As reporters swarmed outside the courthouse, eager for quotes, Frank simply said, "This land belongs to us. All of us. We didn't fight for ourselves. We fought for our future." Back in Willow Creek, the celebration was nothing short of spectacular. The entire town turned out for a massive barbecue at the local park, complete with live music, games, and enough food to feed an army. Grace framed the court ruling and hung it prominently on the Dawsons' porch, a reminder of what they'd achieved together. Linda baked her famous apple pie, cutting slices for anyone who stopped by to congratulate them. But amidst the joy, there was also reflection. Frank knew the victory hadn't come without cost. Friendships had been tested, nerves frayed, and resources stretched thin. Some neighbors still bore scars from the intimidation tactics used by Geotech's crew: tires slashed, threats left on doorsteps, sleepless nights spent worrying about retaliation. Yet through it all, the community had grown stronger, bound together by shared purpose and sacrifice. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Frank sat on the porch with Linda. Jake joined, them leaning against the railing as he scrolled through photos from the celebration. "Dad," he said after a while, "do you think this means we're safe now? Like for good?" Frank hesitated before answering. "I don't know, son. There'll always be someone else looking to make a quick buck off places like ours. But if they come, we'll be ready. This time we showed them we can stand up for ourselves." Linda nodded, squeezing Frank's hand. "And we proved something else too, that working together makes us stronger than any corporation or government permit." Jake smiled, glancing at the framed ruling. "Yeah, I guess we did." As the stars began to twinkle above the fields, Frank felt a deep sense of peace. The land stretched out before him, unchanged and unspoiled, a testament to everything they'd fought for. It wasn't perfect, the scars of the conflict lingered, but it was theirs. And that made all the difference. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to normal. Farmers tended their crops, children played in the streets, and the diner buzzed with laughter and conversation. Grace continued advocating for stricter environmental protections, inspired by the community's triumph. She even started a blog, sharing lessons learned from their experience with other small towns facing similar threats. Bill focused on repairing fences damaged during the standoff, while Anna organized workshops to teach sustainable farming practices. Jake, once shy and unsure of his place in the world, found newfound confidence in standing up for what he believed in. He began volunteering with local conservation efforts, determined to leave a positive mark on the land he loved. For Frank and Linda, the toll sign became a keepsake, a memento of the ordeal that had brought their community closer than ever. They stored it in the barn alongside other relics of the past, symbols of resilience and determination. Occasionally, Frank would pull it out and show it to visitors, recounting the story of how a simple act of defiance had sparked extraordinary change. On warm summer evenings, the Dawsons still sat on their porch, watching the sunset over the untouched fields. They talked about the future, about Jake finishing high school, about expanding the ranch, about dreams they'd put on hold during the fight. But mostly they reflected on how far they'd come. "It's funny," Frank said one night, breaking the comfortable silence. "I never thought I'd be the kind of guy to start a movement. I just wanted to protect my home." "You didn't start it," Linda corrected gently. "You gave everyone else permission to join you. That's what made it special." Frank smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Well, whatever it was, I'm glad we did it. Together." And so, life in Willow Creek carried on, shaped forever by the events of those challenging months. The blockade, the toll booth, the court, battles, they had become part of the town's history, stories passed down through generations. For Frank Dawson and his neighbors, it was proof that sometimes standing your ground could spark a chain reaction of courage, unity, and hope. As the last rays of sunlight faded into darkness, Frank leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities. But tonight, surrounded by the people and land he loved, he allowed himself to rest, to savor the quiet triumph of knowing they'd won.